Okay, so let's continue with Chapter 5, looking at Part 3. We're going to be focusing now on some of the ways that we can process information within short-term memory. And if we think of what short-term memory is about, it's about organizing all the information, all the stuff coming in from the sensory register and kind of making sense of that. So we're going to be looking at rehearsal in short-term memory because that's how we refer to when we think about something. We are rehearsing it, but there are different ways of rehearsing information, so we can kind of separate them out into maintenance rehearsal, which is basically repetition, versus elaborative rehearsal, where we are doing something a little more active than just repeating it over and over again. Maintenance rehearsal, repetition, we do that all the time. So I want you to just take a moment and think about one time that you've used repetition to remember something recently. Could have been for a class, or it could have just been, something you were doing that you needed to remember something and hold it in your memory. Okay, so a common example might be a phone number that you're trying to, keep in your head a little bit. It might be someone's address you might be trying to keep, and you just remember it by repeating it. In contrast, elaborative rehearsal is, again, a little more active, so it involves organizing and connecting to other information. And one of the things we're going to learn is how important this connecting to other information is for retrieval. And remember, forgetting has a lot more to do with retrieval than with the information like decaying and disappearing, from our memory, from our long-term memory. So that connection is going to be really important. There are two really broad ways to do this. One is through what are called episodic associations, and a way to remember what episodic refers to, just think of it as it's connecting things to your own life. So one way of thinking about it is like the episodes of your life. So it's an example, it's in your textbook, is how you might remember your friend's birthday. Now, an episodic association means that you were there at your friend's birthday, and maybe a lot of people were wearing green because it turns out that your friend's birthday was on March 17th. And so from now on, you will always remember what day your friend's birthday is because you remember being at the party and everybody was wearing green. So that would be an example of an episodic association. Okay, so you were there, you're present, and you formed some connection that's based on an experience that you had, and you remember it that way. Another type of association is a semantic one. So this just relies on knowledge that you have. And your textbook again has an example with the word natal, which means birth. And you might remember that by associating Natal Day, which is celebrated in Nova Scotia, with birthday, associated with the birth date of that province in Canada, right? So Natal Day, you might use that to form this association between a new term that you might have not known before, natal, and associating it with the birthday of the Canadian province known as Natal Day. So that might be, an example of a semantic association. So it's whenever we associate something based on, we connect it to something that we already know, something that's already familiar, and we use that. So we're going to see that because, especially for learning, academic stuff, you may not have an episodic association that's relevant for everything, right? So semantic associations can be really helpful. It's how knowledge builds on prior knowledge. And so these semantic associations are really helpful to help us remember stuff. And then we're going to take a look at how elaboration stacks up against repetition, right? Which of these two are better, which is more effective? And to do that, we're going to rely on the level of processing demonstration. That was the word test activity that you would have done online, that we'll go over sort of the theory now of why Group A and Group B might be a little different in their results. Okay, so let's take a look at level of processing theory and how this theory explains how certain types of processing or working with information can be more effective than other types. So they start off with this continuum that we see here. And on one end, we have sort of the shallow processing. On the other hand, we have deeper processing. The most shallow type of processing for, be relevant like for a student would be just to look at something. So maybe, just looking at something in a textbook, not necessarily really even reading it, might be the most shallow form of processing, right? Maybe a little more meaningful would be to read it, and yet we all know that we are capable often of reading a page of text while our minds are wandering. So I would say that another type of processing that would also be pretty shallow would be sort of reading without really thinking about the meaning. So that would be sort of another example of shallow processing, and I would probably put that one, kind of over here on our continuum, right? And then as we move more towards the middle, we can imagine that being like maybe reading while you are thinking about the material. And as we get further into deep processing, according to the theory, well, what is deep processing? And it's essentially anything that involves thinking about and working with the meaning of the stuff that you are reading. Focusing on the meaning, focusing on, maybe making diagrams, those kinds of things. Things that kind of require you to really process the content, of what you're studying instead of just looking at it very, very basic kind of surface way. And so another way you can think about it is that deep processing gets to the meaning of things, whereas shallow processing really kind of is more of a surface. Just you kind of stick to the surface and use very kind of limited processing. And so that's why, it's basically kind of just like looking at a word or series of sentences or even a paragraph would be the most shallow type of processing. Sounding things out, listening to someone, speak to you is relatively shallow, but starts to move a little bit towards the middle along this continuum. And then more on this side of the continuum, then we really have thinking about the meaning of what you're looking at, maybe drawing diagrams and those kinds of things. So that's the very basics of level of processing theory. As a theory, it's a little bit limited or maybe even problematic because it's a little bit circular because, well, what is shallow processing? Shallow processing are types of activities that don't lead to good memory. There's no independent way to verify that these things are really shallow. And then likewise, well, what is deep processing according to the theory? Well, they define deep processing as, yes, using the meaning, but there's no real explanation about why that leads to better recall and better memory versus, these things over here. So the theory is a little bit circular in how it defines shallow and deep. For the activity that you did with the list of words, remember that we had two groups, right? Group A and Group B. So half of you, or approximately half of you, were in Group A, and approximately half of you were in Group B, right? And so Group A, you were the group that had to count the number of vowels, right? And so to count the number of vowels, you really just have to picture the word and kind of look at it, but you don't really necessarily have to think about what it means. In contrast, Group B had to rate how useful the item would be on a deserted island. And that definitely requires you to think about what that item, means. And so the activity that you did, you sort of was trying to put you on the two ends of this continuum where Group A is really kind of just looking at the word, using very shallow processing and counting the number of vowels. You don't have to think of the meaning to do that. And group B definitely had to think of the meaning as you consider, hey, how useful would this be to me if I was on a deserted island? And so typically that type of processing definitely leads to better recall.